Welcome to Tossing Grenades at Windmills. Windmills.
Once he had that thought, his mind began to drift onto what other calories he might be able to reclaim. The thought made him even more nauseated. Then he heard the alarm that Bob was sending him. It had completed its scan. Freight rolled over to one side and slowly crawled off the table and then floated down the hall. It was getting hard to think. Then he remembered that thinking took calories just like anything else, but this time he couldn't stop it, and more importantly, it was the only way he was going to stay alive, assuming he went with that option. Bob's data was largely unreadable at first, just a series of squiggles and lines. Computer, make this make sense. The computer immediately obliged by putting an overlay of the ship on top of the data. There was organic material, all right, but making sense of it all was going to require work. 3 hours worth of work, in fact. He wasn't a scientist or a sensor technician. He didn't normally need to work with chemical sensors, and as near as he could tell, there was promising leads in the crew quarters. He'd searched them before, but it made sense that he'd missed some things. After all, the crew had been able to hide them from both the company and the fat bastards that were trying to find food. He had Bob focus on one of the quarters at a time, taking it apart bit by bit. At first, Bob didn't discover anything. But since he had nothing to lose at this point, and it wasn't him doing the work, he had Bob begin cutting the furniture apart and drill into the walls looking for hidden compartments. Shards of twisted metal lay this way and that. The sparks from the torch lit up the room like a tiny galaxy. And then, in the low-light vision, he could see from Bob's display was a box. He had Bob cut it open and found candy. Glorious chocolate. It was perfect. The annoying part of his mind realized that he was stealing at this point, but given how much damage he had done to the ship, he was doomed to indentured servitude somewhere anyway unless he could find a way to secure his escape. But none of that mattered. Right now, he had to stay alive. He had Bob carefully withdraw all of the edible bits, leaving the personal effects where he found them and put them in a pile. Then he had Bob go to the next room. Things like this went on for several hours. He had to take multiple trips and multiple breaks to remain focused, often taking a trip to the food room and having it whip up something delicious. Despite the fact that it was not real, he knew that he would actually miss this element of his captivity if he got out alive. When he was done, he floated down to the crew quarters to survey his new home. There was a bottle of champagne, no doubt being saved for a special occasion. That would keep him alive for another day if he was careful about it. He found a large box of candy bars, which he presumed the crew members sold on the black market. That would certainly last a while. Freight should know. But the pride and joy of his collection was a pile of 10 Space Marine meals he found in the Master of Arms cabin. He wasn't sure why they were there, but all told, it represented about 25,000 calories. It was a godsend. Properly spaced out, it would make his chances move from an absolute joke to slim. But it might work. He still had to investigate. He blinked a moment, trying to clear his head. Something was wrong. He put his hands in front of his face and saw that they blurred a moment. He felt a thin pressure on the back of his head. He sighed and slowly, patiently began to work his way back to the med bay, but blacked out before he made it. He woke up with a second lump on his forehead and a splitting headache. He felt violently ill and moved to the med bay. It ran another scan. Apparently, he'd received a concussion the first time, and it was causing him some minor damage. It recommended plenty of rest and a healthier diet, of course. He ran the math again, and while it wasn't right back where he started, if the medbot was to be believed, then his chances had become scarce indeed. It wasn't so much that he couldn't try to ignore the concussion, but it simply stated that his chances of survival were that much slimmer if he couldn't maintain an adequate diet. Freight sighed and looked at Bob. "What do you recommend, little buddy?" Bob, who was neither little nor his buddy, nor capable of answering, sat there. He wasn't going crazy. Well, the concussion might say otherwise. He'd enjoyed long periods of silence before. That was part of his line of work. But then again, he'd never come this close to a slow, lingering death before either. He briefly thought about writing up some kind of last will and testament, but anyone he cared about was either dead or too distant to bother with. He took a deep breath. He had to think outside the box here. While he could find ways to eat more calories, maybe what he really needed was a way to reduce the calories that he currently consumed. He put in a query into the database and got some interesting results. There were some things that would reduce the amount of calories he needed each day, but each time with their own side effects. Fortunately, dietary considerations were something the ship's med bay was well prepared for. Jackpot! But even the safety protocols eliminated, too much use would cause his body to shut down. Frank decided that he had to take a break. He floated out to one of the viewports to gaze at the stars. They were fantastic. It was one of the reasons he hated being planetside. Their shocking white, blue, and red hues made him think of the giant fireworks had gone off somewhere and were frozen in time. For a few moments, he really wondered if it was worth it. He had loved his life until now. For this hardship, or worse, the hardship he had yet to bear, it just seemed too much. With the right drugs from the med lab, he could eat like a pig in slop and barely be coherent right before he finally just passed away. It was a right that even the prison ship couldn't deny its inmates. But in the end, he couldn't live like that. Might as well just be an inanimate object at that point. He was alive, and life was sacred, even if that was just his personal choice. But it made him think. He rushed back to the med bay and checked its stock of cybernetics parts. It was extensive. To perform such a complex procedure using just the autodock was horribly risky. But he'd already been rolling the dice too many times, and yet if he didn't try, he was dead anyway. The most perverse part of him also realized that this could be a very perfectly viable source of calories. And so it began a series of perverse choices, weighing the odds of success listed in the machine's database. What did he need? What did he not need? Which parts of him carried the most calories? Would it be better if he did it all at once or a little bit at a time? The sheer horror of it all finally made him snap. He was forced to flee to the medical bay and return to the mess hall. It was safe there. He ate plenty of comfort food. He just ate and ate and ate, and he understood now why the rich enjoyed being fat. A part of his mind knew that he couldn't gain any weight by doing this, but he simply couldn't make himself not do it. He could not make himself cut off his own hand and eat it. After he'd consumed so much it hurt, he just lay there on the floor sulking. Occasionally, the lack of gravity would cause him to float away, but he stubbornly pulled himself back to it and lay there. He didn't want to think about anything. He just wanted it to end. It just wasn't fair. Time passed, as it was wont to do. He sat there and stared at the clock for 5 more hours, just watching minutes of his life tick by, before he finally regained some element of his sanity. All the while, his own body turned traitor against him, consuming itself by burning calories to beat off entropy. What a lie life was. The natural state of the universe was destruction. He should just lie down and die. And then he remembered the waste. Such a choice. But he contemplated going back to the medical bay, and he couldn't make himself do it. He literally could not make himself. He would rather die. With a deep breath, he got up and went to the terminal. Apparently the ship had a low-level radiation sterilizer, so while it might be disgusting, it contained calories. Calories that he was going to need if he wasn't going to die. But he had Bob do it. He became detached from his own body, doubly removed by his possession of Bob, processing bucketfuls at a time and then running them through the scanner. Then, of course, it had to be put in something. The creator cheerfully recommended all kinds of potential dishes. After all, it routinely had to hide the taste of meds that it didn't taste good either. Finally, he chose strawberry ice cream. Bob brought him the plate. He kept the gravity on in the dining room. It made eating more pleasant. He looked at the plate. He looked at Bob. It was perfectly safe. It was perfectly safe. It was perfectly safe. Perfectly safe! He tried eating a spoonful and got dry heaves. He needed anti-nausea medicine for this, but that would mean going to the medical bay, and he couldn't do that. He could, however, send Bob. He looked at Bob. Bob looked back at him. He couldn't send Bob to the medical bay either. He wouldn't do that to Bob. He looked at the plate again. This would be a lot easier if he starved to death. No, that wasn't true. He was starving to death. This would be a lot easier if he felt like he was starving to death. With iron will and 7 tries, he finally tried a bit of it. It tasted okay. Then he spit out the mouthful and washed out his mouth several times. He reviewed his choices. Go to the medical bay, die, eat dung. He finally picked up another spoonful of ice cream and shoved it right in. On one level, it tasted pretty good. On another level, that just made it worse. He was not going to be able to keep it down, which meant that he was going to have to make himself stop throwing up things. But he couldn't go to the med bay. Increasingly, death was looking more attractive. Bob, what would you do? Bob, of course, did not reply. Freight just bought himself more time just eating the food that he did have. He tried to make it last as long as possible, and for the most part he was successful. Denial was a state he was able to live in for another 35 days. Time passed wonderfully. He watched vids, read books, chilled. He almost allowed himself the illusion that everything would be fine. And then the food ran out. He cursed himself. If he'd taken some of the cyberware, he might have had enough food to last until he was rescued. Now he had only hard choices left. Now his mind was once again clear. Now he could not enter denial. He stood in front of the airlock, and he couldn't do it. He pushed his hand to hover over the button that would open the airlock several times. He could not end it. He felt himself grow faint. He knew that he had to choose soon, or hunger would make the choice for him. He slowly began to move towards the medical bay. He tried very hard not to run. Running used calories that he could not afford to lose. The haul loomed and freight swallowed. He liked his body. He did not want to lose it. He screamed in rage. He knew he couldn't afford the calories. Freight didn't care. He pounded the side of the wall. Finally, he resolved himself to it. It would be painful, unbelievably painful, but it had to be done. He programmed the computer to run a series of complicated surgeries to knock him out in the process. He managed to detach himself from it all, and he would just pretend it wasn't real. The final step was to have Bob restrain him. This was harder than it looked, but he managed it nonetheless. He couldn't afford to move around while he was under the anesthetic. Once he was sure that he was secure enough, he said, "Auto-dock, initiate procedure." The machine spent several minutes calibrating itself, but it injected with anesthetic right away. He could feel a warm malaise warm over him and considered the futility of it all. If only he'd never come onto the ship. If only he'd left more food. Maybe he should have used the sensors one more time to check for the food. He stopped, his eyes snapping wide open. The sensors! He realized through the haze of the anesthesia that he'd been an idiot all along. He wasn't entirely shut out of the ship's systems. He could create a distress call by using a coded sensor ping. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it had much better odds of success than this madness. He fought against the restraints and couldn't undo them. Auto-dock, stop procedure. Please repeat request. He yawned. It was no good. His speech was too slurred. He fought against the restraints with all his strength. His muscles had atrophied from weeks of zero-G and malnourishment. But he was still a man in his prime, and the restraints had only been meant to hold him while unconscious, not fight against them. He felt the restraints begin to give. As the buzzsaw started, it let out a petulant whine and began to descend. Freight screamed and struggled harder against the restraints. He had no choice but to escape. Since he had moved, the machine could end up killing him now. The restraints began to break. The buzzsaw entered his skin and began to cut. This time he screamed in pain, and the resulting additional adrenaline let him get free of the table. But he was bleeding profusely. He became a celebrity, almost a legend, when they found the empty ship and the single corpse. The new Flying Dutchman, they called him. The man who almost made it. Some say that Freight's corpse is still floating through the depths of space, hungry, seeking, never finding.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson.
Copyright 2015, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC. All products available on Amazon.com and other markets.
To fight the forces of evil!